The Grand Hall of Xenobiological Studies at the Galactic Science Academy sparkled like a crystal cave, its transparent walls refracting light from 3 different suns. Professor Nixis, a towering figure whose iridescent scales shifted between deep purple and midnight blue, glided to the center of the amphitheater. Their 4 pairs of eyes scanned the assembled students, representatives from over 50 different species, all considered the brightest minds in their respective civilizations. Today, Professor Nixis announced, their vocal sacs producing a melodious resonance that immediately captured every student's attention, we begin our most controversial unit, Class 13 Planets, specifically focusing on a peculiar world called Earth. The mention of Earth sent ripples of electromagnetic interference through the room as several silicon-based students buzzed with excitement. A holographic projection materialized above the central podium, showing a small blue-green planet that seemed remarkably unremarkable. In the front row, Krasthor of the Sentinel Collective shifted his massive crystalline frame, causing his reinforced seat to groan under his weight. As the strongest warrior of his species in 10 generations, he had been sent to study potentially dangerous life forms across the galaxy. So far, he remained unimpressed. Professor, Krasthor's voice rumbled like distant thunder. Our preliminary scans show this planet's dominant species lacks basic biological weapons. No plasma glands, no quantum torpedoes, not even basic psychic abilities. How could this qualify as a Class 13? Professor Nixis's scales rippled with an emotion that might have been amusement. Ah, Krasthor, tell me, in your extensive combat experience, have you ever encountered a species that developed deadliness through what we might call lateral evolution? Before Krasthor could respond, the hologram shifted to display various Earth creatures. A particular focus lingered on something so small it had to be magnified several thousand times to be visible. This, Professor Nixis continued, is what the humans call a spider. Specifically, one of their more interesting varieties. And next week, we will be visiting Earth's premier arachnid research facility. The announcement caused an immediate uproar. A gaseous student nearly condensed from shock, while several others began rapidly filing safety protocol queries into their neural nets. But Professor, called out Zixia, a luminescent being from the Andromeda arm, the insurance forms alone would take 3 solar cycles to process. Professor Nixis's scales shifted to a satisfied gold. Already approved, the facility's human scientists have agreed to host us, though they did request we sign several hundred pages of liability waivers. Something about their last alien visitors and an incident with what they call a platypus. Krasthor's crystalline structure emitted a frequency of dismissal. I have survived direct hits from cosmic ray bursts. My external matrix can withstand temperatures hot enough to melt neutron stars. Are you suggesting these tiny Earth creatures pose any real threat? The professor's scales darkened to a deep crimson. In fact, Krasthor, I'm counting on that very attitude. The universe has many ways of teaching humility, and Earth specializes in delivering those lessons in particularly memorable ways. The hologram shifted again, displaying medical reports from previous expeditions. Several students recoiled as they processed the data, their various sensory organs registering disbelief. Pack your environmental suits, students. Professor Nixis announced with what might have been a touch of mischievous glee. And remember, on Earth, size has absolutely no correlation with deadliness. In fact, quite often, it's the inverse. As the students filed out, chattering in their various forms of communication, Professor Nixis added one final note to their lesson plan. Note to self: prepare extra medical stasis pods. Something tells me Krasthor's education is going to be particularly enlightening. In the following days, as the Academy buzzed with preparations for the Earth expedition, Krasthor spent hours in the virtual reality chamber, studying Earth's so-called deadly creatures. With each simulation, his dismissal grew stronger. How could these primitive organisms pose any real challenge to a warrior of his caliber? Little did he know, Professor Nixis had deliberately withheld certain crucial details about Earth's arachnids. After all, some lessons were best learned through direct experience. The terrestrial xenobiology research complex materialized through Earth's atmosphere like a mirage, its bioadaptive shields rippling in the Australian sun. The class's quantum vessel, shaped like a perfect dodecahedron, settled onto the landing pad with barely a whisper. Professor Nixis noticed several students activating additional layers of their protective suits before the airlock even cycled. Dr. Rajesh Patel waited on the landing pad, remarkably exposed in what appeared to be nothing more than light fabric covering, and a device the humans called sunglasses. His casual stance caused several students to emit distress signals that their threat assessment protocols were malfunctioning. "Welcome to TXRC," Dr. Patel called out, his voice carrying across the landing pad with surprising clarity. "I trust your quantum fold through spacetime was comfortable." His eyes crinkled with amusement as he watched the alien students process his lack of protective gear. Krasthor emerged last from the vessel, his crystalline form refracting sunlight in dazzling patterns. "Your facility's atmospheric composition is within tolerable parameters," he announced, deactivating his outer shield layer in what was clearly meant as a show of superiority. "Though I fail to see why such elaborate containment protocols are necessary for studying primitive life forms." Dr. Patel's smile took on an interesting quality that Professor Nixis recognized from their previous visits to Earth, the expression humans made when they knew something you didn't. "Perhaps a tour of our specimen collection will help illuminate things," he said, gesturing toward the facility's main entrance. "Though I should mention, please stay on the marked pathways. We had a slight issue with the fire ants last week." As if on cue, a small insect wandered across Krasthor's path. The warrior student deliberately placed his crystalline foot near it, expecting the creature to flee. Instead, the ant immediately began secreting a substance that started smoking against his supposedly impervious external matrix. "Fascinating," Professor Nixis commented, their scales shifting to an intrigued turquoise. "The formic acid composition has evolved to be particularly potent in this region." The main exhibition hall stretched before them like a cathedral dedicated to Earth's most lethal organisms. Containment fields hummed with barely perceptible energy, housing everything from tapeons to box jellyfish. Each specimen was accompanied by detailed holographic readouts of their defensive and offensive capabilities. "Currently, we house approximately 3,000 different species," Dr. Patel explained, leading them past a display containing what appeared to be a simple aquatic creature. This blue-ringed octopus could kill 20 humans with a single bite. Thankfully, they're usually quite peaceful, unless you happen to step on one while swimming. Several students instinctively activated their levitation modules. But of course, Dr. Patel continued, approaching a heavily secured door, "You're here for our arachnid collection. We've prepared something special for today's demonstration." Krasthor's crystalline structure emitted a frequency that translated roughly to boredom. "I have reviewed the data on your planet's arachnids. Their primitive venom delivery systems pose no threat to advanced life forms." Dr. Patel paused at the security scanner, his hand hovering over the biometric reader. "You know, it's interesting you mention that. We recently completed a study on venom evolution in Australian spiders. Would you be interested in participating in a controlled demonstration? Professor Nixus's scales shifted rapidly through warning colors, but before they could intervene, Krasthor stepped forward. I would welcome the opportunity to prove the superiority of evolved defenses over primitive biological weapons. Excellent. Dr. Patel's enthusiasm seemed genuine, though something in his voice made several students edge toward the exit. We'll set up in Containment Chamber 3. Professor Nixus, would you mind helping me with some preliminary safety protocols? As they walked ahead, discussing preparations in hushed tones, Krasthor remained behind, studying the specimen tanks with growing confidence. A gelatinous student named Blobvula oozed closer to him. Perhaps, they suggested through chemical signals, this demonstration is unwise. My species catalogue indicates Earth's creatures often possess unexpected defensive capabilities. Krasthor's crystalline structure pulsed with dismissive light patterns. Your concern is noted but unnecessary. These primitive organisms rely on chemical compounds that cannot penetrate my matrix. This demonstration will serve to prove that advanced evolution will always triumph over simple biological weapons. In the containment chamber ahead, Dr. Patel was carefully preparing a special enclosure while discussing something with Professor Nixus that made their scales turn an alarming shade of chartreuse. Neither of them seemed to notice the tiny dark shape that skittered briefly across the corner of the preparation table, disappearing into a shadow just as Krasthor entered the room. The stage was set for a lesson that would be remembered in the annals of the Galactic Science Academy for generations to come, though perhaps not for the reasons Krasthor imagined. The containment chamber gleamed with medical-grade sterilization fields, its hexagonal walls designed to contain everything from quantum anomalies to dimensional rifts. Dr. Petal stood before a small, transparent cube that seemed almost disappointingly ordinary. Before we begin, he announced, addressing the assembled students, I should explain our safety protocols. The demonstration cube is surrounded by 7 layers of containment fields, each calibrated to... Unnecessary, Krasthor interrupted, his crystalline form pulsing with impatient light. My matrix can withstand the heat of dying stars. What damage could a primitive arachnid possibly inflict? Professor Nixus's scales flickered with concern. Krasthor, perhaps we should review the complete data on Australian spider venom before. With respect, Professor, Krasthor's voice resonated through the chamber. I believe this excessive caution merely reinforces outdated perceptions of primitive species. I propose a direct interaction test. Dr. Patel's expression remained carefully neutral. You want to physically interact with the specimen? Precisely. My species has evolved natural defenses against all known toxins in the galaxy. A practical demonstration would be most educational for my fellow students. Several of those fellow students were now backing toward the observation area, their various sensory organs registering increasing levels of alarm. Blobvula had actually started secreting their species equivalent of nervous sweat, creating a small puddle of iridescent liquid beneath them. Dr. Patel exchanged a long look with Professor Nixus before speaking. Very well, but we'll need to document your baseline readings first. Standard protocol. As the human scientist began setting up monitoring equipment, Professor Nixus addressed the class. Observe carefully. This will be an excellent opportunity to study the interaction between advanced defensive adaptations and Earth's evolved offensive capabilities. The professor's scales had shifted to a color that several students recognized as their "this is going to be painfully educational" shade. Dr. Patel finished his preparations and approached the containment cube. Within it, barely visible against the dark backdrop, sat a small spider. Its legs spanned less distance than a human's thumbnail, its dark body unremarkable, except for a subtle blue sheen that caught the light. "This is a male Sydney funnel-webbed spider," Dr. Patel explained. "Recently matured and currently in what we call his wandering phase. This makes them particularly responsive to interaction." Krasthor moved closer to the cube, his crystalline structure analyzing the tiny creature. "Its size is barely registerable on my sensors. You say this is one of your deadliest species?" "Oh, yes," Dr. Patel replied, his tone carefully professional. "Their venom has some rather unique properties. For instance, it's one of the few compounds known to." But Krasthor had already stepped forward, deactivating his outer defensive layers. "Let us proceed with the demonstration. I will allow the specimen to attempt to breach my matrix." Professor Nixus's scales rippled with alarm. "Perhaps we should establish a baseline for the venom's interaction with crystalline structures first." "Unnecessary," Krasthor declared. "My matrix has resisted quantum torpedoes. This will be educational for the class. Proof that advanced evolution will always triumph over primitive defense mechanisms." Dr. Patel's hand hovered over the containment field controls. "Last chance to reconsider. This particular specimen has been displaying unusually high aggression levels." "Proceed," Krasthor insisted, his crystalline form glowing with confidence. The human scientist nodded, then began the containment field deactivation sequence. As the barriers dropped one by one, the tiny spider seemed to become more alert, its legs shifting position with precise, deliberate movements. The final field disappeared with a soft hum. For a moment, nothing happened. The spider remained motionless, seemingly uninterested in the towering crystalline being before it. Then Krasthor made what would later be recorded in the Academy archives as mistake number 1. He reached into the cube to prove his point. The spider moved. What happened next would be the subject of numerous scientific papers, 3 galactic conference presentations, and at least 1 doctoral thesis on the folly of underestimating Earth's evolutionary arms race. No one in the observation area would ever forget the sound that followed, a sound that, until that moment, no one believed a crystalline being could make. The spider moved with impossible speed, its legs finding purchase on Krasthor's crystalline surface with unnatural precision. Before anyone could react, it had already begun its work, fangs designed by millions of years of evolution meeting supposedly impervious crystal. The first crack appeared with a sound like breaking stars. "Fascinating," Professor Nixus remarked, their scales shifting rapidly through shades of scientific excitement and horror. "The venom appears to be catalyzing a molecular breakdown of the crystal matrix." Krasthor's electromagnetic field fluctuated wildly. "Impossible. My structure is." His protest cut off as more cracks began spreading from the bite point, creating a web-like pattern that mimicked the very creature causing it. Dr. Patel was already moving, his hands flying over the emergency protocols panel. "The venom contains a compound we've never seen before," he explained while activating containment fields. "It seems to identify and exploit molecular weak points in crystalline structures. Rather beautiful, really, from a purely scientific perspective." The spider, meanwhile, had skittered to another position on Krasthor's surface, its movements precise and purposeful. Second bite. More cracks. Krasthor's usual luminescent glow began to dim in patches. "Should we not assist?" asked Globula, their gelatinous form quivering with concern. "Absolutely not," Dr. Patel and Professor Nixus answered in unison. The specimen is displaying standard hunting behavior. Dr. Puttle continued, now recording readings with remarkable calmness. Interrupting at this stage would only aggravate it further. Besides, this is providing invaluable data on xenobiological venom interactions. Krasthor attempted to activate his emergency defense protocols, trying to generate the energy field that had protected him from cosmic radiation and plasma weapons. The field flickered weakly, then died completely as the spider delivered a third bite. Remarkable, Professor Nixis observed. The venom appears to be interfering with his energy generation capabilities. Note how the crystalline deterioration follows the natural energy flow patterns of his matrix. The once mighty warrior's voice had taken on a distinctly higher pitch. "I'd request assistance." Of course, Dr. Petal responded, finally activating the emergency containment system. A specialized field gently separated the spider from its victim, carefully transferring it back to its enclosure. The tiny arachnid seemed almost smug as it settled back into its corner. Medical teams rushed in, their specialized equipment already analyzing the extent of the damage. Krasthor's once perfect crystalline form now bore a complex network of cracks and clouded patches where the venom had begun breaking down his molecular structure. "Don't worry," Dr. Puttle assured the stricken warrior as treatments began. "We've developed an effective counteragent, though you may experience some interesting effects during the healing process. Your matrix might emit rainbow patterns for a few weeks." Professor Nixis addressed the stunned class, their scales now a deep shade of educational satisfaction. "And this, students, is why Earth is classified as a Class 13 planet. Size, technological advancement, and even evolutionary complexity are not always accurate predictors of defensive capability." They gestured to the spider, now peacefully grooming itself in its enclosure. This specimen's ancestors survived multiple mass extinction events, evolved alongside some of the most dangerous creatures this planet has produced, and developed venom that can affect everything from mammals to, as we've seen, crystalline life forms. Blobula raised a pseudopod. But, Professor, how did it know where to strike? The structural weaknesses in Krasthor's matrix should have been impossible to detect without advanced scanning equipment. Ah, Dr. Petal smiled. That's the truly beautiful part. These spiders have evolved sensors that can detect the electrical fields generated by nervous systems. They essentially read their prey's biological energy patterns. Krasthor's crystalline matrix, with its energy channels, must have looked like a billboard advertising prime target spots. From the medical bay, Krasthor's voice emerged, slightly distorted by the healing field. "I may need to revise my thesis on primitive defense mechanisms." Professor Nixis's scales shifted to a gentle shade of approval. "And that, students, is the most valuable lesson Earth has to teach us. Never assume that simple means ineffective, or that primitive means harmless. Evolution has had billions of years to perfect its work here." The class watched in thoughtful silence as the tiny spider began constructing a web in its enclosure, its movements precise and purposeful, every action the result of countless generations of refined survival strategies. Dr. Petal made one final note in his research log. "Specimen demonstrates unprecedented effectiveness against crystalline life forms. Recommend updating galactic hazard classifications." Again. 3 Earth weeks later, the Galactic Science Academy's main lecture hall was unusually crowded. Students from across all departments had gathered to hear what had become known as the Spider Incident presentation. Krasthor stood at the podium, his crystalline form mostly healed, but still displaying faint rainbow patterns where the spider's venom had affected him. The once arrogant warrior's electromagnetic field now pulsed with a notably more humble frequency. My previous understanding of evolutionary advancement was, he paused, his structure shifting slightly, incomplete. I believed that technological and biological complexity were the ultimate measures of species development. Earth has proven this assumption dangerously incorrect. Professor Nixis watched from their position at the side of the hall, their scales a pleased shade of turquoise. The lesson had been expensive, both in terms of medical treatments and Krasthor's pride, but invaluable. The spider, Krasthor continued, displaying a hologram of the specimen, exhibited what I now understand to be convergent evolution at its finest. Its venom didn't just evolve to be deadly, it evolved to be versatile. The compound can affect biological, crystalline, and even some synthetic materials. All this from a creature smaller than a stellar dust particle. In the audience, globula had formed themselves into a perfect sphere of attention, absorbing every word. Other students were frantically taking notes, particularly those from species that had previously dismissed Earth's wildlife as primitive. But perhaps most significantly, Krasthor's voice resonated with new understanding. This experience has led to an important breakthrough in our own defensive technology. By studying how the spider's venom identified and exploited weaknesses in my matrix, we've developed improved shielding systems that could revolutionize space travel safety. Dr. Petal, who had traveled from Earth for this presentation, nodded approvingly. The research collaboration between Earth's arachnologists and the Sentinel Collective's engineers was already producing remarkable results.